The station was called Varion Prime, and it floated in space like a crown made of glass and steel. It was massive, so big that ships from 7 different civilizations could dock inside it at the same time without ever getting close to each other. The station had been built over 100 years ago by a group of alien races who wanted one place where all species could meet and talk. It had wide halls, tall ceilings, and lights that changed color depending on what part of the station you were in. For most species, Varion Prime was a symbol of how far the galaxy had come. For humans, it was something they had only heard about until now. The Grand Convocation had been called once every 50 years. It was the only event where a new species could apply to join the Galactic Alliance, a group of 7 civilizations that shared trade routes, defense agreements, and technology. Every species that had ever applied had gone through years of preparation. They sent their best soldiers, their greatest scientists, their most polished diplomats. They showed up with big ships and long lists of achievements. They tried to look impressive. The human ship was not impressive. It was called the Relay 4, and it was a mid-sized diplomatic vessel with worn paint on the outside and a small crew of 4 people. When it docked at Varion Prime, the other ships around it were 3 times its size. One of them, belonging to the Kreth Dominion, had golden panels on its hull that caught the light of the nearby star. The Relay 4 had a dent near the cargo hatch from a supply run gone wrong 6 months earlier. Nobody had fixed it. Cal Dunn walked off the ship first. He was 34 years old, average height, with dark hair that needed a cut and a jacket that fit him well enough but was not special. He carried a worn bag over one shoulder and a thin tablet under his arm. He was not a general. He was not a famous scientist. He was a cultural liaison, someone whose job was to go to strange places, learn the language, learn the customs, and figure out how to talk to people without starting a war. He had been doing it for 12 years across 9 different star systems. Behind him came Nora Price, a xenobiologist who studied how living things adapted across different planets. She was 28, quiet, and almost always had a small recorder in her hand. After her came Lou Grant, 53 years old, a field engineer and veteran pilot who had fixed more broken machines in more dangerous places than he could remember. Last came Diana Cole, 26, a linguist on her first major assignment. She kept looking around at everything with wide eyes and trying not to show how nervous she was. The main hall of Varion Prime was enormous. It had a high domed ceiling with transparent panels that showed the stars outside. Around the room, delegates from 6 other civilizations were already seated at long curved tables. There were the Kreth, tall and silver-scaled, known for their rigid military culture. There were the Orveth, ancient and slow-moving, who had been part of the Alliance longer than any other species. There were the Mollin, the Duvari, the Shen Collective, and the pale diplomatic caste of the Vorith. Each delegation had arrived with large teams, formal uniforms, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing you belonged somewhere. Prince Vale of the Kreth Dominion was the first to notice the human delegation walk in. He was seated near the center of the curved table, tall even while sitting, with silver scales that caught the light and amber eyes that looked at things the way a judge looks at evidence. He watched Cal Dunn find his seat. He watched the small team set down their bags. He leaned toward the Kreth delegate beside him and said something in their language. The delegate laughed. A few others nearby heard it and smiled. Cal heard it too. He spoke Kreth. He had learned it 9 years ago in a listening post on the edge of their territory. What Vale said, loosely translated, was, "The infant species has arrived. Somebody go find them a smaller chair." Cal set his bag down. He pulled out his tablet. He poured himself a glass of water from the small pitcher on the table. He did not look at Vale. He did not say anything. Nora sat beside him and quietly powered on her own device. Lou leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Diana sat very still and stared at the table. The convocation was called to order by the lead judge, an Orveth elder named Counselor Theen, who had white hair, slow hands, and a voice that carried across the room without her ever raising it. She welcomed all delegations. She explained the 3 trials. She said that the goal of the convocation was not to find perfect species, but honest ones. When she finished, Prince Vale was the first to speak from the floor. He welcomed the human delegation too, in the common galactic tongue so everyone could understand. He said it was good that the infant species had finally found the courage to come. He said he hoped the long journey had not been too hard on such small vessels. He looked directly at Cal when he said it. Several delegates in the room chuckled. Cal looked up from his tablet. He met Vale's eyes across the room. He held the look for just a moment, not with anger, not with fear, and then looked back down at his notes. He turned to a blank page and wrote one word at the top. He wrote it as a reminder to himself. The word was patience. The trials would begin in the morning. Cal had read every record he could find on what those trials involved. He had studied for 3 years for this moment. He was not here to look impressive. He was here to do the work. And he had learned, in 12 years of going to hard places and talking to difficult people, that the ones who talked the loudest at the start were usually the ones who had the most to prove. He drank his water. He read his notes. The stars outside the dome burned on in silence, exactly as they always had. The first trial began at sunrise, which on Varian Prime meant the overhead lights shifted from deep blue to a warm amber and a soft tone rang through the corridors. Cal was already awake. He had slept 4 hours, which was about as much as he ever managed before something important. He was sitting at the small desk in his room with a cup of black coffee, reading over notes he had already read 20 times, when Diana knocked on his door to tell him the others were ready. The hall for the Trial of Knowledge was different from the main convocation hall. It was smaller, more formal, with a long raised platform at the front where the judges sat, and rows of seats below for the delegations. Each delegation had its own section, separated by low dividers. The questions would be given by the judges, and each delegation would respond in turn. There was no hiding. If you did not know something, everyone in the room would see it. The Kreth went first, as they had earned by arriving at the station earliest. Their team of 8 answered with precision. They knew their physics, their history, their biology. They spoke quickly and without hesitation. When the judge finished their section, there was a quiet murmur of approval around the room. Prince Vale sat in the observation gallery. Above, watching with his arms folded and a calm expression on his face. When it was humanity's turn, a few of the delegates in the room shifted in their seats to get a better look. Some were curious. Some were waiting to see a mistake. The judge assigned to the human section was a Kreth official named Arbiter Doss, who had sharp features and a flat voice. He had chosen the questions himself. The first few were straightforward: basic galactic physics, shared history of the station, standard diplomatic protocol. Cal answered them calmly and correctly. Nora handled the biology questions with quiet confidence. Lou did not speak much, but when a mechanical and engineering question came up, he gave an answer so detailed and specific that Arbiter Doss had to pause for a moment before moving on. Then Doss asked a question that was not on the standard list. It was a Kreth philosophical riddle, framed as a logic problem, about how a civilization should choose between the survival of its knowledge and the survival of its people. It was a trick. The correct answer, according to Kreth tradition, was that knowledge must be preserved at all cost. Any other answer was considered a mark of intellectual weakness. But the question had a hidden flaw. It assumed that knowledge had value independent of the people who held it, which was a circular argument that the original Kreth philosopher who wrote it had later rejected in his own final work. Cal answered it in Kreth. He cited the original philosopher by name, gave the date of his final published work, and explained precisely why the question as posed contained a logical error. He then gave the answer the philosopher himself had eventually settled on, which was that the question was wrong to begin with, because knowledge and people cannot be meaningfully separated. Arbiter Doss was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he made a mark on his tablet and moved on. In the observation gallery, Prince Vale's expression did not change, but he uncrossed his arms. Nora's section came next. She was asked to classify a set of organisms from a planet that none of the delegations had visited. The standard classification system used by the Alliance grouped organisms by their cellular structure and reproductive method. Nora used that system, then went further. She introduced a secondary classification method she had been developing for 2 years, based on how organisms adapted to environmental stress across generations. It was not in any galactic textbook. It was her own work. The Orvith scientist at the judge's table leaned slowly forward as she explained it, his old eyes tracking every word. When she finished, he raised one long finger to ask a clarifying question. It was the first time any judge had voluntarily engaged with a delegate's response rather than simply evaluating it. The afternoon brought the trial of endurance. The delegations were taken to a large simulation room where a scenario was projected around them in full sensory detail. A colony ship carrying a civilian population had suffered a catastrophic failure in a remote system. Resources were limited. There was no outside help available. The delegation had to manage the situation for a simulated 40 hours and bring as many people through as possible. The alien delegations followed their training. The Kreth ran military-style triage. The Orvith applied layered resource rationing protocols. The Mullen delegation coordinated with calm efficiency. Each team had a plan and they followed it. Their results were good. Cal's team did not have a single rigid plan. They had talked about it the night before and agreed on one principle: stay flexible and keep looking for options others would not try. When the simulation's power grid failed in the 4th hour, cutting off heating to the civilian quarters, Lou Grant took apart a component from the ship's non-essential communication array and rebuilt it into a secondary heating circuit in under 2 hours using tools that were not designed for the job. It worked. It kept working for the full simulation. When a food shortage hit in the 16th hour, Nora identified 3 species of plant life on the nearby planet that were safe for the colony's dominant species to eat. She had figured it out by cross-referencing the planet's atmospheric composition with a database of known compatible organisms. It was not a guaranteed solution, but it was a real one, and it bought them time. At the end of the 40 hours, Cal's team had achieved the highest civilian survival rate of any delegation. Not by a small margin. In the corridor outside the simulation room, Lou leaned against the wall and rubbed his eyes. Diana was writing everything down in her notebook. Nora was already reviewing her notes on the plant classification she had used. Cal stood quietly and looked at nothing in particular. He was thinking about the next trial. He was also thinking about the way that Orvith scientist had leaned forward during Nora's explanation. It was a small thing. But small things, in his experience, were usually where the truth lived. He pushed off from the wall and told the others to get some rest. Tomorrow would be harder. The formal dinner was held in the lower wing of Varion Prime, in a hall that was older than the rest of the station. The walls were dark stone, lined with carved panels that showed the founding of the Galactic Alliance. The tables were long and low, arranged in a wide circle so that every delegation could see every other. The food was prepared in the shared galactic style, dishes that were safe for most species to eat, though nothing was quite right for anyone. It was the kind of meal where the food was less important than the conversation. Cal sat between Nora and Diana. Lou had taken the seat at the end of the table, which he always preferred. Around them, the other delegations ate and talked in small groups. The hall was full of sound, the clicking speech of the Shen collective, the low harmonic tones of the Orvith, the sharp consonants of the Kreth. Diana was doing her best to follow 3 conversations at once. Lou was eating steadily and not saying much. Nora had found a quiet moment to review her notes from the simulation. Cal was watching Prince Vale. Vale was standing near the center of the room with 3 other Kreth delegates around him. He was holding a tall glass of something dark and speaking in the common galactic tongue, which meant he wanted the whole room to hear him. His voice carried easily. He had the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. He began by raising his glass in a formal toast to the convocation. That part was normal. Then he kept talking. He said it was a remarkable thing to see so many great civilizations gathered in one place. He said each species brought something worthy to the table. The Kreth brought strength. The Orvith brought wisdom. The Mullen brought precision. The Shen brought communication. Then he paused, as if remembering something, and looked toward the human table. He said it was also good to see the humans here. He said it with a smile. He said he found them fascinating in the way one finds a young child fascinating, full of energy, unpredictable, occasionally surprising, but not yet ready to be trusted with anything important. He said humans had short lives, which perhaps explained their habit of rushing into things without thinking. He said they had a long history of fighting each other, which perhaps explained why they were so easily offended. He said their bodies were soft and breakable, which was not their fault, but was worth noting. He said all of this in a smooth, even tone, as if he were making reasonable observations rather than insults. Several delegates around the room laughed. A few looked uncomfortable. No one said anything to stop him. Nora put down her notes. Diana's jaw tightened. Lou set down his fork very slowly and looked at the table. Cal stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a dramatic gesture. He simply stood and asked, in the common galactic tongue, if he might respond. Vale turned toward him with an expression of polite amusement, as if a small animal had decided to speak, and waved his hand in permission. Cal thanked him for the observation. Then he said that Vale was right on every point. Humans did have short lives. Humans had fought each other many times, over many centuries. Human bodies were, by galactic standards, fragile. He said all of this plainly, without embarrassment. Then he said something else. He said that what Vale had described as weakness was actually the source of something the other species in this room had either lost long ago or never needed to find. He said that because human lives were short, humans had learned to move quickly, to value each day, to build things that would last beyond themselves. He said that because humans had spent so much of their history in conflict, they had developed a deep understanding of what causes war and what stops it, an understanding that only comes from having lived through both. He said that because human bodies broke easily, humans had spent 10,000 years becoming experts in survival, adaptation, and problem-solving under pressure. He said the human body was not a weakness. It was a research project that had been running for 100,000 years. Then he stopped being general and started being specific. He looked at the Kreth delegates and said that 600 years ago, the Kreth Empire had collapsed 3 of its own colony systems through resource mismanagement. It had taken them 2 centuries to recover. He cited the date, the systems, and the name of the Kreth historian who had documented it most thoroughly. He said he admired how the Kreth had rebuilt. It was an impressive achievement. He asked only that they remember what rebuilding cost. He looked at the Orvith and mentioned, gently, the Great Silence, a period 800 years ago when the Orvith had withdrawn entirely from galactic diplomacy after a disagreement with the Shen. The other species had been left without their oldest mediators for 40 years, and 3 small wars had started in that time. He said the Orvitha's return had been one of the most important moments in Alliance history. He said he meant that with complete sincerity. He went around the room. Not every delegation, but enough. Each mention was accurate. Each one was framed not as an attack, but as a piece of real history that the species in question would rather not have named out loud in a room full of their peers. He did it without anger. He did it without a raised voice. He did it the way a person points out a fact that everyone already knows but no one has bothered to say. When he finished, he thanked Prince Vale again for the opportunity to speak. He sat down. He picked up his glass and took a small sip. The hall was quiet. Not politely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that fills a room when someone stops talking. It was the deeper kind, the kind that comes when a room full of intelligent beings all arrive at the same thought at the same moment and none of them are sure what to do with it. Prince Vale stood very still. His expression had not changed, exactly. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Lou picked his fork back up and resumed eating. Diana let out a slow breath. Nora looked at Cal for a long moment, then looked back at her notes. Cal said nothing more. He had said what needed to be said. The rest of the dinner passed quietly. The night before the final trial, Cal did not sleep at all. He sat at his small desk with the lights turned low and read through the available records on previous convocations. He was looking for something specific, any information on how past delegations had handled the trial of Will. The records were incomplete. The trial was kept deliberately vague so that no species could over-prepare. But there were patterns. Every delegation that had ever faced it had been given a scenario with 2 choices. Every single one had picked one of the 2 options given. No one had ever done anything else. Cal wrote a single question on his notepad and sat with it for a long time. The question was, why does everyone assume there are only 2 choices? He went to Lou's room at 3 in the morning. Lou answered the door immediately, which meant he had also been awake. Cal laid out what he was thinking. Lou listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Cal valued most about him. When Cal finished, Lou was quiet for a moment, then said he thought it might work but that the timing would be extremely tight. Cal said he knew. Lou said they would need Nora's help for the biological part. Cal said he was going to knock on her door next. Nora was awake too, reviewing her classification data. She listened to the plan, asked 4 sharp questions, found answers to 3 of them immediately, and said she would figure out the fourth by morning. Diana, when Cal finally woke her, did not say much. Just pulled out her notebook and started writing down what they would need. By the time the trial of will began the next morning, Cal's team had been awake for over 30 hours. The simulation room had been reconfigured overnight. The scenario appeared around them like a world being born: stars, a distant system, a damaged ship tumbling slowly in a wide gravitational field. The judges' voices came from everywhere and nowhere, explaining the situation in calm, measured tones. A generation ship carrying 4,000 civilians of a neutral species had suffered a catastrophic power failure in an uninhabited system. The gravitational field it had drifted into would pull it apart within 90 hours. The delegation had a rescue vessel with enough fuel for one approach and limited equipment on board. Two options were available: attempt a partial evacuation and save roughly 2,000 people, or attempt a full hull stabilization that had a 40% chance of saving everyone but required the rescue crew to stay at the site past the point of safe return. Every alien delegation before humanity had faced a version of this. Every one of them had run the math and selected an option. The Kreth had selected the partial evacuation, maximum guaranteed survival. The Orveth had selected the hull stabilization attempt, maximum potential survival. The Mullen had selected partial evacuation with modifications. All of them had answered the question as it was given. Cal's team deliberated for 11 minutes. The observers in the gallery watched them. Prince Vale was there, seated and still. Then Cal submitted a third response. His team would not attempt the partial evacuation. They would not attempt the hull stabilization using the standard method. Instead, they would first send Lou to the damaged ship alone on a low-fuel trajectory, a route that used the gravitational field itself to carry him there rather than fighting against it, which cut fuel consumption by 60%. Lou would then access the ship's emergency systems and locate its auxiliary power nodes. He had identified, from the ship's publicly available design specs, that generation ships of this class carried backup thermal regulators in the hull plating itself, regulators that were not connected to the main power grid and therefore still functional. If those were manually rerouted, they could buy the civilians enough time for a full evacuation with multiple passes. Meanwhile, Nora had identified that the neutral species on the ship had a biology that allowed for a much longer period of low-oxygen survival than the standard galactic safety protocols assumed. The stations on the damaged ship were designed for a conservative estimate. If the civilians were moved to the lower decks and the oxygen consumption was managed carefully, they could survive up to 30 hours longer than the scenario assumed, which changed the math on every possible rescue window. The plan required Lou to be alone on the damaged ship for a period that exceeded safe exposure limits. It required the rest of the team to make multiple rescue runs with degraded fuel. It required everything to work on the first try with no margin for error. It was not the safe answer. It was not a choice between the two options given. It was the thing that the scenario had not offered them, but that the problem actually required. The judges were silent for a long time after the submission. The simulation around the delegation flickered once and then held. Counselor Thien, the lead Orveth judge, spoke first. She asked Cal why his team had chosen a path that put every member of the rescue crew in danger of not returning. She asked it plainly, as a genuine question, not a challenge. Cal answered her the same way. He said that 4,000 people were on that ship. He said that his team had found a way to save all of them. He said that when you find a way to save everyone, you take it, even if the cost is yours to pay. He said that was not a calculation. That was a decision. The room in the gallery was silent. Vale sat forward in his seat, slowly, without seeming to realize he was doing it. The Orveth scientist who had leaned forward during Nora's biology presentation was watching with both hands flat on the table in front of him. It was the Orveth posture for deep attention. Counselor Thien looked at Cal for a long moment. Then she looked at the other judges. One by one, they looked back at her. No words were exchanged. But something passed between them that was clear enough. She thanked the human delegation for their response. She told them the results would be announced at the final session the following morning. She told them to rest. Cal nodded. He thanked her. He led his team out of the simulation room and into the corridor. Diana immediately sat down against the wall. Nora closed her eyes for a moment. Lou said nothing, but he put a hand briefly on Cal's shoulder as he walked past. Cal leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling. He was very tired. But underneath the tiredness there was something else, something calm and settled, like ground that had been tested and held. He thought about the question he had written the night before. Why does everyone assume there are only two choices? He folded the notepad and put it in his jacket pocket. He did not think he would need it anymore. The final session was held at midday. The overhead lights in the grand hall were at their brightest, and the transparent dome above showed a clear view of the star system outside, stars and dark space and the slow distant movement of a nearby moon. Every delegation was present. Every seat was filled. The 6 alien civilizations had arranged themselves in their formal positions, the same way they had been on the first day. The humans sat where they always sat, in their modest section, with their modest team. Cal had changed into his cleanest jacket. That was his only concession to formality. The others had done the same, in their way. Lou had combed his hair. Diana had tied hers back. Nora wore a small pin on her collar that had been given to her by her first research mentor. She wore it whenever something important was happening. Counselor Theen walked to the front of the hall slowly, as all Orveth moved. She stood at the speaker's platform and placed both her hands on the edge of it and looked around the room. She did not smile. She rarely smiled. But there was something in her expression that was open, the way a door is open when someone has left it that way on purpose. She began the assessments. She went in order of arrival at the station, which meant the Kreth were first. She spoke about their performance with clear respect. She noted their precision, their discipline, their command of galactic history and protocol. She said they had performed as expected of a senior Alliance civilization. It was high praise, delivered in the careful language of formal review. She moved through the other delegations. The Orveth assessment was brief, as they were judges and not applicants. The Mullen received recognition for their efficiency. The Duvari were commended for their communications approach in the trial of endurance. The Shen Collective was acknowledged for their work in the knowledge trial. Each assessment was careful and honest and fair. Then Counselor Theen paused. It was not a long pause, but it was noticeable. Around the room, people shifted slightly in their seats. She began speaking about the human delegation. She did not begin with their trial scores. She began with something else. She said that in 42 convocations over 400 years, she had seen species prepare for the trials in many different ways. Most came with the best version of what they already were. They showed their strengths and hoped the weaknesses would not be noticed. That was a reasonable approach, she said, and it produced reasonable results. She said the human delegation had done something different. She said they had not tried to look like something they were not. They had come as themselves, small team, modest ship, no performance of greatness. And then, without announcing it, they had done things that none of the other delegations had done. She described Cal's response to the trick question in the knowledge trial, and how it had shown not just knowledge but an understanding of intellectual honesty that went beyond what the question was designed to test. She described Nora's classification method and said the Orveth Science Council had already requested a copy of her work. She described Lou's improvisation during the endurance trial and said 2 Alliance engineers had asked about the technique he had used. She described Diana's language work during the knowledge trial's cross-cultural communication segment, which had been evaluated separately and had scored higher than any delegates in the last 6 convocations. Then she talked about the trial of will. She said that every previous delegation had answered the question that was given to them. She said the human delegation had answered the problem that the question was pointing at. She said there was a very large difference between those two things, and that the difference was not a small one. It was the kind of difference that determined, over time, whether a civilization made the galaxy better or simply passed through it. She said that the human team's answer had required them to accept personal risk in order to fully solve the problem. She said that this was not irrational. She said that it was, in fact, the most rational response available, because the goal was never to minimize the cost to the rescue team. The goal was to save 4,000 lives. Everything else was secondary. She looked out over the room. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said that the convocation had made a decision. She said that by unanimous agreement of all presiding judges, the standard 18-month probationary period for new Alliance members would be waived in the case of humanity. The human species was being offered full membership in the Galactic Alliance, effective at the close of the session. The hall went silent. It was the kind of silence that fills a large space the way water fills a container, completely, into every corner. No one moved. No one spoke. The clicking language of the Shen collective stopped. The low tones of the Orveth faded. Even the ambient hum of the station seemed to quiet. Prince Vale of the Kreth Dominion sat in his seat and stared at the front of the hall. His hands were flat on the table. His face was still. Something that might have been understanding, and might have been something harder to name, moved behind his eyes. The Orveth scientist who had watched Nora's presentation so carefully rose from his seat. He was very old, and it took him a moment to stand fully upright. But he stood. That was the Orveth gesture of recognition, rising for someone you considered a peer. One by one, around the room, other delegates rose. Not all of them, but more than half. And they rose quietly, without drama, which made it mean more. Cal did not stand to receive it. He sat in his seat and looked at Counselor Thien and nodded once. A small, genuine nod. Then he turned to his team. Nora had her hand pressed flat over her mouth, and her eyes were full. She did not look away. Lou was staring at the table with his jaw set in the way he set it when he was holding something in. Diana had her notebook open and was already writing, because she understood that someone needed to record this moment, and that was her job, and she was going to do it properly. Cal put his hand briefly on Nora's shoulder. He told Lou they should probably start thinking about the message home. Lou said that was a good idea. Diana said she was already drafting it. The session formally closed 20 minutes later. The delegations began to move and talk, and the hall filled again with sound. But for a moment, just before the noise came back, Cal looked up through the dome at the stars outside. They were the same stars that had been there when he arrived. They did not look different. They did not care about what had just happened. They had been burning for billions of years, and they would go on burning long after every civilization in this room was dust. He found that comforting, in a way he could not quite explain. He picked up his bag. He walked out of the hall and down the long corridor toward the docking bay. When he reached the end of the corridor and looked out the wide observation window, he could see the Relay 4 sitting in its berth, small and worn and dented near the cargo hatch. Around it, the great ships of 7 civilizations sat in their own docks, silent and vast. He stood at the window for a moment. Then he went to find his team, because there was a message to send, and a long journey home, and a great deal of work left to do.